People say scary stories are just fiction, but every legend starts with a truth someone wished you'd never know.
It was the creaking sound at 3:13 a.m. that woke me. It wasn't the familiar groan of my old house settling. No, this sound was deliberate, a slow, agonizing whine of wood bending under weight. I froze in bed, straining my ears to catch any hint of movement. The silence that followed was heavier than the humid Mississippi night air. My heart raced, pounding so loud I feared it might give me away. As I held my breath, a faint tapping sound began, almost playful, like a child drumming fingers on a table. It came from beneath the floorboards. I told myself it had to be raccoons. The old farmhouse I had inherited from my grandmother was full of nooks and crannies that critters loved to explore. Yet something felt wrong. Raccoons didn't tap in rhythm. And they certainly didn't stop tapping when you whispered, "Who's there?" I had moved to the small town of Pine Hollow 3 months ago after my grandmother's sudden death. She'd left me her house, a creaky, sprawling thing built in the 1800s with wide porches and peeling white paint. The kind of house you'd see on postcards advertising quaint southern charm. But charm was in short supply. The house was cold even in the summer, the plumbing groaned like a dying animal, and the floors never stopped creaking, no matter how still I stood. Still, it was mine. And for someone like me, recently divorced, barely scraping by with freelance graphic design gigs, it felt like a lifeline. I spent most of my days trying to transform the house into something livable. Scrubbing years of grime from the windows, repainting the kitchen, and fixing whatever minor disasters cropped up daily. It was lonely work, but I didn't mind. Loneliness had become a familiar companion. The locals were friendly enough, though I stuck out like a sore thumb. They'd wave at me when I went into town to grab groceries, their southern accents thick and honeyed. A woman named Margaret at the hardware store even offered me a free box of nails once, saying, "You'll need these, sugar, for that house of yours. You know she's got her secrets." I laughed it off then. Every old house had secrets, didn't it? Creaky floors, hidden drafts, and probably a few mice in the attic. But now, lying in bed with that rhythmic tapping echoing beneath me, Margaret's words took on a darker meaning. By the time dawn broke, the tapping had stopped. I told myself it was a restless night, nothing more. Maybe I'd imagined it, or maybe some animal had found its way under the house. But as I brewed my morning coffee, a strange detail came back to me. The tapping had stopped immediately after I spoke. I shook it off, choosing not to dwell on it. I had enough to worry about without letting my imagination run wild. Bills were piling up, and I had a deadline looming for a client who insisted on tweaking every pixel of his logo. Life didn't leave much room for ghosts or mysterious noises. Still, as I sat at my desk later that afternoon, sketching out a rough design, I couldn't shake the sense of unease. The air felt heavier, the house quieter than usual. Even the familiar groan of the plumbing seemed absent. I kept glancing at the old grandfather clock in the corner, its hands frozen at 2:47. I'd meant to fix it weeks ago but never got around to it. Now, its stillness felt accusatory, like it was holding its breath along with me. It wasn't until I was cleaning the basement that I noticed the door. Hidden behind a stack of dusty boxes was a small, unassuming door set into the brick wall. It was no taller than 4 feet and painted the same dull gray as the surrounding stone. I had walked past it a dozen times without giving it a second thought, assuming it led to some long-sealed crawl space. But today, something drew me to it. The hairs on my arms stood on end as I knelt down to inspect it closer. There was no handle, only a rusted keyhole that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. I ran my fingers over the surface, feeling the rough texture of the peeling paint. That's when I noticed the scratches. Long, deep grooves marred the wood, as if someone, or something, had clawed at it, desperate to get out. I stumbled back, my heart racing again. This was ridiculous. It was just a door. Probably another storage space my grandmother had boarded up and forgotten about. Yet, as I stood there, staring at it, a cold draft seeped from the edges, carrying with it the faint smell of damp earth and something metallic. Blood? I backed out of the basement, my breath coming in shallow gasps. That night, as I lay in bed, the house felt alive around me. The walls groaned and sighed like they were stretching. Shadows danced across the ceiling, though there was no light source to cast them. And just as I was finally drifting to sleep, I heard it again. The tapping. Louder this time. Rhythmic. Insistent. Coming from beneath the floorboards. The next morning, I resolved to forget about the door in the basement. I had no time to entertain ridiculous notions of ghosts or whatever else my overactive imagination could conjure. But as I sipped my coffee in the kitchen, staring out at the overgrown backyard, a strange thought crept into my mind. What if I open it? The idea hit me like a whisper in my ear, soft yet insistent. I shook my head, setting my mug down with more force than necessary. This was absurd. I'd call someone, maybe a contractor, to check it out. That's all. But the feeling lingered throughout the day, gnawing at the edges of my mind. And then the disturbances began. At first, it was small things, objects not where I'd left them. My phone, always on the counter near the sink, was suddenly in the living room. A pile of folded laundry had been knocked over on the bed. Then there were the sounds. In the daylight, they were fainter, but unmistakable. A faint scratching behind the walls, the low hum of something moving just out of sight. That evening, I noticed something even stranger. The clock. The old grandfather clock in the corner of the living room had begun ticking again, its hands moving in a slow, deliberate crawl. Except they weren't ticking forward. They were moving backward. I stood frozen, watching the clock unwind itself. The faint chime it let out every hour was warped, low and dissonant, like a note played on an out-of-tune piano. I reached out to stop it, but before my fingers touched the glass, it stopped on its own. Its hands settled at 3:13, and the house fell deathly silent. That night, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent than before. It wasn't just beneath the floorboards this time, it was everywhere. In the walls, the ceiling, the very air around me. I buried myself under the covers, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The sound was inescapable, like it was echoing inside my skull. Then came the voice. It was barely a whisper, low and rasping, carried on the same cold draft that had seeped from the basement door. I couldn't make out the words, but it was there, unmistakable. Someone, or something, was speaking to me. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay in the house. I packed a bag, intending to head into town and stay at a motel until I could figure things out. But as I reached for my car keys, they weren't there. I checked every drawer, every surface, but they were gone. Damn it! I shouted, my voice cracking with frustration. I grabbed my phone to call a locksmith, but the screen was blank. No signal. No Wi-Fi. Even the landline was dead. It was as if the house was trapping me, refusing to let me leave. I didn't know what else to do, so I went to the basement. I told myself I was just going to look, to prove to myself that there was nothing to fear. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't stop at looking. The door was calling me. As I descended the creaky stairs, the smell hit me again, that same metallic, earthy scent that reminded me of a freshly dug grave. The air was colder here, and every step felt heavier, like the very house was pushing back against me. When I reached the door, I noticed something new. The scratches on the wood were deeper, more frenzied. And this time, they weren't just on the door, they were on the floor and walls around it, as if whatever had clawed at the door had tried to escape in every direction. My hands trembled as I ran my fingers over the keyhole. It felt cold, unnaturally so, as if it were made of ice instead of rusted metal. I knew I needed a key, but where would I find it? I spent the rest of the day tearing the house apart, looking for anything that resembled a key. I searched drawers, cabinets, even the attic, but found nothing. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the walls, I slumped onto the couch in defeat. That's when I heard it, a faint metallic clink. It was coming from the old piano in the corner of the living room. I hadn't touched the piano since I moved in. It was an antique, out of tune and covered in a layer of dust. Cautiously, I approached it, my footsteps echoing in the empty room. The clinking sound grew louder as I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled between the rusted strings, was an old iron key. It was large and ornate, with an intricate design that looked almost like a series of interwoven vines. My heart pounded as I held the key in my hand. It felt heavier than it should, its cold surface sending shivers up my spine. I knew where it belonged, and I knew what I had to do. That night, the house seemed to come alive around me. Shadows twisted unnaturally on the walls, the faint whispering growing louder and more coherent. My name. It was saying my name. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, the key clutched tightly in my hand. As I descended, the air grew colder, the smell stronger. When I reached the door, the tapping stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, as I slid the key into the lock, the house let out a low groan, like a dying animal. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but pitch-black darkness beyond. And then I saw them, two glowing eyes staring back at me. The glowing eyes froze me in place, their cold, inhuman stare rooting me to the spot. My breath hitched as the air seemed to thicken, each inhale a struggle against the oppressive weight of the darkness spilling from the open doorway. The eyes didn't blink, didn't waver. And then, they were gone. The eyes blinked out like a snuffed flame, leaving nothing but an empty, yawning void beyond the threshold. I stepped back, heart pounding, my grip on the flashlight trembling. As much as I wanted to slam the door shut and bolt up the stairs, a strange compulsion pulled at me, a need to understand, to know. I shone the light into the room, revealing rough brick walls and a dirt floor. It looked like an old storage space, nothing out of the ordinary. No glowing eyes, no monsters lurking in the corners. But something wasn't right. The floor was uneven, mounds of dirt rising in irregular patterns. At first, I thought they were just piles of debris. Then I saw it, what looked like a skeletal hand protruding from the largest mound. My stomach turned. The hand was brittle and gray, its fingers curled as if reaching for something. Or someone. I backed away, my flashlight flickering. I didn't know what I was looking at, but my mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was an old burial site. Maybe my grandmother had stumbled upon it and sealed the door to keep it hidden. Maybe the eyes were just a hallucination, a trick of the light and my fraying nerves. That's what I told myself as I forced the door shut, locking it with the heavy iron key. But deep down, I knew the truth was far more sinister. I didn't sleep that night. The tapping returned, more aggressive, more deliberate. It wasn't just in the walls anymore, it was under the bed, behind the door, in the very air around me. I felt it vibrating in my bones, a rhythm that echoed the frantic beating of my heart. And then came the voices. Not just whispers now, but full, guttural words spoken in a language I didn't understand. They rose and fell like a chant, pulling me toward the basement with a force I couldn't resist. I tried to fight it, clutching the bed frame like it was an anchor, but my body betrayed me. I stood, feet moving of their own accord, dragging me toward the source of the sound. The basement door was already open when I got there, the key lying on the floor as if it had been placed there just for me. The air was icy, my breath visible in the dim light. The chanting grew louder, a chorus of voices blending into a haunting symphony. I descended the stairs, the flashlight flickering weakly in my hand. When I reached the bottom, the door was ajar again, revealing the same dark room. Only now, the mounds of dirt were gone, replaced by deep, gaping holes. The skeletal hand I had seen earlier was no longer there. And then I felt it, a presence behind me. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body screaming to run, but it was too late. Standing at the foot of the stairs was a figure, its shape shrouded in shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. Its eyes glowed once more, piercing through the darkness with a malevolent intensity. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth, like it was gliding rather than walking. What do you want?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. The figure tilted its head, as if considering my question. Then, without warning, it lunged. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of one of the holes and landing hard on the dirt floor. Pain shot through my arm, but I didn't have time to process it. The figure loomed over me, its form shifting and expanding, tendrils of shadow reaching out to envelop me. My vision blurred as the chanting grew deafening, each word a dagger slicing into my mind. I felt myself being pulled into the hole beneath me, the dirt shifting and collapsing around me. And then, I understood. The holes weren't graves, they were doorways. Gateways to something far beyond my comprehension. The figure wasn't trying to kill me, it was trying to take me. To pull me into whatever hellish place it came from. I screamed, clawing at the dirt, trying to pull myself free, but the shadows held me fast. My fingers found the edge of the flashlight, and in a desperate move, I swung it upward. The beam hit the figure square in its face, or what I assumed was its face, and it recoiled with an ear-splitting shriek. The shadows released me, and I scrambled to my feet, bolting up the stairs without looking back. I slammed the basement door shut, twisting the lock so hard I thought it might break. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and the house was eerily quiet. The key was gone, and the basement door was locked tight, as if nothing had happened. I wanted to believe it was over, that whatever had happened was just a nightmare. But as I stepped outside, gasping for fresh air, I saw them. Footprints. Deep, heavy imprints in the dirt, leading away from the house and into the woods. And they weren't mine. The footprints haunted me. For hours, I stared out the window, watching the edge of the woods, half expecting whatever had left those marks to come back. But nothing emerged. Just the swaying of the trees in the wind and the distant chirp of birds that felt too loud, too cheerful, given the weight in my chest. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. The memories of the shadowy figure, the chanting, the holes in the basement, all of it clung to me like smoke. Every creak of the floorboard sent shivers down my spine, every shadow on the wall made my pulse quicken. I packed a small bag, not caring where I went as long as it was far from Pine Hollow. But as I reached for the door, I noticed something strange. The flashlight. It was sitting on the table by the stairs where I'd left it after scrambling out of the basement. But it wasn't dirty anymore. The scratches and grime were gone, the glass spotless, the metal gleaming as if it were brand new. I hadn't cleaned it. My chest tightened as I approached it. It shouldn't have been possible. Tentatively, I reached out and picked it up. It felt wrong, colder than it should be, the weight unfamiliar. As I turned it over in my hands, I noticed a small engraving on the side. Property of Margaret H. Margaret. The woman from the hardware store. The one who had warned me about the house. My heart raced as memories flooded back, her knowing smile, the way she'd said, "You'll need these, sugar, for that house of yours. You know she's got her secrets." I grabbed my keys and bolted out the door, the flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. Margaret would have answers. She had to. The drive into town felt like a fever dream. The trees lining the road seemed to stretch endlessly, their shadows dark and oppressive, blotting out the sunlight. The closer I got to Pine Hollow, the more the world seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, the colors duller, like I was descending into some other reality. When I pulled up to the hardware store, it was closed. The "open" sign hung crookedly in the window, and the lights inside were off. But Margaret's truck was parked out front. I banged on the door, shouting her name, desperation thick in my voice. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. Margaret stood there, her face pale and drawn, her eyes sunken as if she hadn't slept in weeks. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's happening to me?" I demanded, holding up the flashlight. "What is this? What's wrong with that house?" Her eyes widened at the sight of the flashlight, and she took a step back, crossing herself. "You opened it, didn't you?" she said, her voice trembling. "Opened what?" She shook her head, her lips quivering. "The door. In the basement. You let it out." Margaret led me to the back of the store, where a dusty, cluttered office held stacks of old papers and photographs. She pulled out a faded map, spreading it across the desk. It was a layout of the town, but it was different. There were markings, red X's, scattered across the map, each one labeled with a date. "This town was built on cursed land," she began, her voice shaky. "Centuries ago, a coven was executed here. They swore revenge, cursed the ground to trap their killers and anyone foolish enough to disturb their rest." I pointed to one of the X's, near where my house was located. "And the door?" "It's a seal," she whispered. "One of many. Your grandmother knew. She kept it locked, kept it safe. But when she died," Margaret's voice broke. "They've been waiting for someone like you. Someone who would open it." I stared at her, my head spinning. "I didn't mean to." "It doesn't matter," she interrupted. "They're free now." I left the hardware store with more questions than answers. Margaret refused to say more, her face pale and her hands trembling as she pushed me out the door. The drive back to the house was a blur, my mind racing. Every explanation seemed more absurd than the last, but deep down, I couldn't shake the truth of her words. When I reached the house, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. I stepped out of the car, the oppressive silence of the place hitting me like a physical weight. The footprints were gone. The air smelled different now, acrid, like something burning. I stepped inside, and that's when I saw it. The grandfather clock was gone, leaving behind only a gaping hole in the wall. The pictures on the walls were all wrong. The faces in them, family members, old portraits, had changed. Their eyes were black voids, their mouths twisted into grotesque smiles. And then I saw myself. In the mirror by the stairs, my reflection stared back at me. But it wasn't me. Its eyes were the same glowing orbs I had seen in the basement, its mouth curling into a wide, unnatural grin. "You never left," it whispered, its voice echoing in my mind. "You've been with us all along." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't standing in my house. I was still in the basement. The door hadn't let them out, it had pulled me in. Everything I'd experienced, the town, Margaret, the house, it was all part of their trap, a web of illusions designed to keep me here. As I turned to run, the walls began to close in, the shadows swallowing me whole. The last thing I heard was the sound of tapping, rhythmic and unrelenting, as the darkness claimed me.